today. We had 31 as of 9:30 this morning. And we know it's like school is starting and Labor Day is around the corner and all these kinds of things. So, but we do anticipate that this is a topic that's going to have a pretty long tail because we're going to be in this trauma for a while. So let me kick it off. My name is Rebecca Ryan, and today I am joined by Dr. Charlie Grantham, who's going to be our co-host and co-guide for today. And as many of you know, we've changed the format a little bit, and Yasmin Arakan, my colleague and also a futurist, she is helping moderate the chat and keep things rolling so that I can keep my ear in the conversation instead of an ear in the conversation and an eye on the chat. So it's wonderful to have all of you together today. The topic for today is post-traumatic growth. And I want to share just a little bit about why this feels extremely relevant to me at this time. And I'm sure you guys have your own reasons, and I'd love to hear those. Throw them in the chat. But I started listening to a new webinar, a new podcast series called The Next Big Idea. And one of the people who was featured on an episode that I listened to was Adam Grant, the researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. He's written several excellent books. And he introduced this idea of post-traumatic growth. And it was like lightning struck. I was literally ironing napkins. Who does that? I do. I was raised by German Lutherans. I was ironing napkins, listening to this podcast, and it was like lightning struck. And I heard him talk about post-traumatic growth. And, you know, we started this webinar series trying to think about optimistic futures, that it wasn't an option to just snap back to January 2010. We wanted to snap forward. So as Grant was talking about the attributes of post-traumatic growth, I thought, holy smokes, I bet our participants, our community here would probably like to talk about this because we all have an interest in building back in a more positive, hopeful, in a way that works better for more people. So, you know, part and parcel of thinking about post-traumatic growth is thinking about trauma. And my friend, my colleague, Dr. Charlie Grantham, he's in our Signals panel. Steve Craig is on the call again today. Steve and I and Charlie and several others of you meet a couple times a week, and we talk about signals impacting local government. And several weeks ago, Charlie said that he's working on this idea of cultural trauma, that the pandemic has caused cultural trauma, and what might that look like down the line. And Charlie himself has an interesting story about his relationship to trauma, and I'll let him tell that. But he was the first person I thought to reach out to, like, Charlie, let's talk about post-traumatic growth. So let me put the caveat on this. Although Charlie has a PhD in sociology, and although I have dropped out of 2 master's programs, neither of us is a counselor or a therapist. Nobody should count on us as being the definitive word on what trauma is or what it isn't or how you should deal with it. We do have some resources that we encourage you to tap into if you feel that you need those kinds of valuable services. But we're not here to you know, give clinical advice or give medical advice. Charlie and I are here as 2 futurists who are trying to figure out what the long-term scars and the long-term growth could be coming out of this as we think about a society that could work better for more people. So with that, Dr. Charlie, do you want to give a few of your bona fides so that folks can get the lay of the land of how you're coming to this, what your context is?
Sure. Let me give some context here. But first of all, I'm an associate with the Association of Professional Futurists, thanks to Rebecca. So that's my futurist hat I have on. And she mentioned I'm educated as a sociologist. I did my doctoral dissertation research at the National Institute of Mental Health on the use of social networks to mitigate stress. I won't tell you how long ago I did that, but it has been a while, but it's a topic coming back now. I'm also, curiously enough, a certified Reiki master teacher. So you're going to hear me talk a little bit about energy healing and Eastern versus Western traditions of dealing with trauma and stress. I'm also a fellow with the American Institute of Stress, so I'm pretty deep into this stuff. And I'm also a PTSD survivor. I'm a combat veteran, and that's one of the little baggies that I have to carry around with me. So what you're going to hear me talk about, I've been to this rodeo myself. So some of it's going to be from personal experience. So, okay.
All right,
That's,
let's jump in. Thank you. Thanks, Charlie. You can call him Dr. Grantham. You can call him Charlie. We just call him
call
when
me
we,
anything.
yeah, we just call him when we need help about the future.
Just don't call me Shirley.
That's it. So I want to start with this, whether we think about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or we think about post-traumatic growth, trauma is in the center of it. And as I've been doing my research about post-traumatic growth, it's like you don't get the post-traumatic growth unless you have the trauma to begin with. So Charlie, I wonder if you could tell us how you think about trauma.
Sure. Let me start by giving folks an idea of the scope of the issue we're dealing with here. Latest estimates I've seen from the National Institute of Health is we can expect by the middle of next year, 2021, to have 90 million people in the United States experiencing one degree or the other of post-traumatic stress based on all of the trauma that's going on. That's 90 million people. That's a pretty big number. So by way of definition, there's really two levels of trauma. Level one is the trauma that you experience directly, like you were in the traffic accident, you were the person that got assaulted or abused or whatever, but it was a direct experience. The second level is level two trauma, which we refer to as kind of a cumulative thing that everything adds up. And the curious thing there is trauma in your family or your neighborhood or someplace else that people have experienced, you get some of that also. So you can see how this adds up pretty quickly. If you're in a family unit going through what's going on now and you come down with COVID, dad's unemployed, mom's got to stay home and teach the kids, all of this stuff adds up. So there's kind of those two levels. I'd also...
I'm sorry, let's just stop there just for a second because,
Sure.
you know, you and I have had the benefit of tracking this since March.
Right.
And I remember maybe week 4 into this, you said, you guys, we're going to see a whole bunch of mental health spill off from this. And there's been a lot of data about the number of people who, or the increase, I should say, in the number of people who are experiencing some anxiety, some depression, you know, some of these clinically identifiable issues. And I wonder if you want to, you've talked about what we can expect by the middle of 2021. 90 million Americans will be impacted by some sort of trauma, according to these two definitions you've just given us. But when you think about anxiety, when you think about depression, I think we can all identify with some level of that. There's probably for many of us been a point where we could hardly catch our breath thinking about what the hell is going on and what could happen. So can you give us some context about the COVID related kind of the signifiers, the signals that you've been looking for over the course of the last few months?
Well, let me start with what I believe is the psychological impact of COVID. It's uncertain. We don't know when it's going to end. That's probably the first thing. The second thing is, I don't want to say it's hopeless, but we're not quite sure if we're going to get a vaccine, if there's going to be some major bullet out there, and all of that stuff built. So we don't know when it's going to end. We really don't know how severe it is. And then, you know, God forbid something happens and you actually contract it or somebody in your family does, that just blows it right out of proportion. So, I mean, we're all, the anxiety, the depression of various degrees, we've all talked to people, and then coupled with the fact that we really can't get together like we used to socially, that kind of destroys a major link that most of us use of social interaction to mitigate stress. So we've got a double whammy going on here. So
yeah,
Charlie, if we get another lockdown, that's going to be like an accelerator for this. Okay.
The way that I've been thinking about this is it's like debits and credits, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like we have all these things that are eating away at our capacity to deal with the change, the uncertainty of it, as you mentioned, you know, not knowing exactly how long or when. I have to say, one of the things I'm thinking about is, let's say we do get a vaccine, but 40% of Americans say, I'm not taking a vaccine. I'm an anti-vaxxer. So
Right.
it's like, even if we do get a vaccine, holy crap, where are we at then, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's kind of like the debits, right? And the credits used to be the warm hugs. You know, the number of grandparents I've heard who are
Yeah.
just distraught by not being able to, there's one, right? Not being able to hug their grandkids, spend significant time with their grandkids. And they know it's just because their grandkids are trying to protect them, but it doesn't diminish the fact that you're not getting the, you know, physical touch. And how important that physical touch is from other people. So the debits and the credits are super out of whack. And what I'm hearing you say is you put enough of those together, and of course you're going to get anxious. Of course you're going to get depressed, on top of the fact that there's an uncertain future around this. So anyway, I don't want to interrupt, Charlie, but I just want to share kind of another way of thinking about this from a, you know, I'm not clinical at all. I just know how it feels in my body.
Well, you summed it up quite well. And the one thing I would offer up, to look around you and see, are other people experiencing, you know, extreme distress, if you want to use that word, is if they start to disengage. If they start to disengage with their friends, with their family, with their neighbors and their coworkers, that is not a good sign. If you see that going on, or if it's happening to you, that's a sign. It's probably time to reach out and get some help someplace, because it kind of, it's like it's a black hole that as you disengage, it gets worse and worse. And then the more you disengage, and pretty soon you see people curled up in a little ball at the end of the couch, sobbing all of the time. And you know, you've got a big issue. Um, to me, it's this uncertainty thing, and also a feeling of helplessness. Like, well, what can I do? I can wear a mask. I can stay 6 feet away from everybody. Okay, that's fine. But I lost my job, and I can't find another job. And, or as just happened to one of my neighbors, they lost their house. So all of a sudden, you've got this physical health danger. The economic thing is crashing down on you, and there's no resources out there readily available for you to deal with it. So it's just a perfect storm. And just to go off on that a little bit, those folks in Texas and Louisiana this week, you know,
Right.
they got another level hit them.
Yeah.
And it's not an additive thing, is what I want to say. It's multiplicative. It's not like 1 + 1 + 1. It's like 1 plus, you know, times 2 times 4 times 8. So it's at that level.
I appreciate that. I want us to talk in just a moment about, you know, some of the other ways that we can think about. I mean, certainly what we're talking about is Debbie Downerville, right? I mean, it's like, there's no end in sight. This is awful. We're not getting our credits filled. So if we put a circle around all this trauma that we're feeling, what are the differences between this trauma stopping us cold and this trauma being something that, you know, not only do we sort of recover from, do we heal from eventually, but what marks the growth pattern? What marks post-traumatic growth? And I expect, Charlie, that you're going to come at this not only from your own experience of being a combat veteran and having true PTSD, but also as a researcher, you know, as somebody who's looked at this stuff. What do you think?
The signs that you look for and the things that you can do to help people are really increased engagement with other people. And that can be in a group therapy setting. I'm not a great believer in online interaction as a way to deal with this. That may be something you want to do in crisis mode, but probably not in standard, you know, trying to come out of this. And I want to read you a quote, and this is, I don't want to be Dave the Downer here. I want to shed a little hopefulness on this, because we are going to talk about some ways to grow. And the quote has been attributed to a whole bunch of people, and I'm not sure exactly who the first one is, but it's something like this: character is forged in the oven of adversity. So we're in the oven of adversity with all of this cultural trauma going on. But it's going to make people stronger. And a couple of things you look at, like, well, who's going to get stronger? It's usually folks who are more extroverted, and it's usually folks who are more just in general have some emotional stability in their life. So you go, oh, okay, those are the folks who are going to grow first and fastest. And people who may not be in that situation, there's this thing, it's learned optimism, I think is the technical term. There's actually educational programs that or training, whatever you want to call it, that you can put yourself through that really help you learn how to be more optimistic and more stable. And that becomes the basis for growing. In my own example, I throw in, it was the ability to interact with other people who had experienced the same degree and same type of trauma that I had, turned out to be the most effective therapy, or most effective intervention. So it was the human to human thing that really worked. I mean, they tried for years, giving me all kinds of pills and drugs, happy things, didn't work. Because when you get down to it, extreme trauma that we're talking about changes your brain physiologically. The pattern by which the neurons travel in your brain and where the blood flows and all of the chemicals that are created and secreted changes you physically. So it's not just, oh, buck up and get over it, it's your attitude. It's not that at all. It's much more serious than that. And you're going to be getting some of these references to the things I'm talking about. So it's not just Charlie blowing hot air.
Yeah.
That help, Rebecca?
Yeah, it does. Charlie, I want to take one step back, because one of the things that you mentioned is like when you start to notice people, I think you used the term withdrawing. Was that the term you used, withdrawing? So I actually think it would be useful for this group to just kind of self-reflect. Withdrawing is one sort of symptom of people experiencing trauma, but I think there are others as well. And I think it would be useful to sort of check in with ourselves. There doesn't need to be any sharing, but check in with yourself, but also think about the people around you. Because this is not something that a lot of people have language for. So could you give us a couple of the other signifiers of trauma? So there's withdrawal. What else?
The other thing that you can see is sort of unexplained, what we call diffuse outward expressions of hostility. Sorry, there's a lot of sociological terms there, but that's people who just have outbursts towards other people and normally are kind of calm and reserved, and all of a sudden they just explode at the least little thing. And we're seeing more and more instances of that, right? When we get into the Karens and the Kevins, but that kind of behavior actually is an expression, is a reaction to the trauma and the stress.
I appreciate you mentioning that. I was having a physically distanced, I refuse to say socially distanced. I was having a physically distanced get together with one of my BFFs, and she said, in my 20s, I was like an 8 out of 10 on kindness. And as I got into my 50s, I was like a 6 out of 10. She's like, right now I'm like a 3 out of 10, teetering on a 2. And she pointed to several examples of these diffuse outbursts that are completely out of character, but would be an indicator, right? Like she's internalizing some of this trauma. Charlie, a couple of the other things that people might want to check in themselves or in the people that they love or might be concerned about are hopelessness. Like when people feel there is no hope. Right. And I do remember at the beginning of this First Fridays series, or this Futures Friday series, we felt a lot of hopelessness, like in the chats, people saying like, how do we have hope? How do we carry on? Related to that, helplessness. How would you as a sociologist define the difference between hopelessness and helplessness? Because they both feel very debilitating.
Yeah, hopelessness is if you look out in the future and you can't see a better situation out there. You don't have any hope that it's going to get better. Helplessness has to do with the lack of support. I feel helpless. There's nothing I can do to make this situation better. So if you combine those things, you can see how this works now. because I can't do anything to make it better. And besides, I don't see anything out there in the future that's going to make it better or relieve the pain and the suffering that I'm feeling. And those things kind of feed off of one another.
That's so interesting, because I talk all the time about the upper right-hand corner, right?
Yeah.
About how we can keep a sense of perspective and a sense of control. And that gets to, I think, both of the points you're making. Hopelessness is the future looks like shit. There we went and lost our rated G again. And helplessness is, and there's not a darn thing I can do about it. So if you stay in that no perspective, no control, I call that freak out corner. I guess we can now call it trauma corner.
Right.
Versus what are the things we can do to lengthen our gaze? What are the things we can do to actually take control over some things? I think the fourth thing that you had mentioned to me about a sign of trauma was suicidal ideation. And we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but I think we should mention it because there are people who are hurting, and especially if they feel no hope and absolutely helpless. What does suicidal ideation mean to a sociologist?
Well, and that's kind of the first crisis indicator. And the question, quite simply, is: are you having thoughts, or have you had thoughts about harming yourself or others?
Yep.
And anybody who responds to that and say, "Yeah," the next question down is, have you been planning to do something? And if they answer yes to that, that's when you pick up the phone.
Yeah, yes, I think this would be a great time to put the crisis line in the chat, just in case anybody knows somebody who is feeling this way. And boy, if you know that people are feeling this way, that is a cry for help. Because very often people keep these things close to the vest, especially in North America. We see it as a sign of weakness. So, all right, so we've talked about these four kind of components of trauma, and now let's really pivot into the post-traumatic growth. I remember when lockdown started, and I realized a couple days before Governor Evers here in Wisconsin put us under it officially, which the Supreme Court later said you can't do, sir. But we started sheltering at home. March 11th was officially the day that we said, we're not going to the office anymore. We're done. We're not traveling. Cancel everything. And I remember my prayer was, let this pandemic change me. Let this pandemic change me. And I just tried to begin to orient myself towards how this pandemic could be useful, not just terrible. I knew the terrible parts those were non-negotiable, and I had no control over many of those things, right? But what the things I did have control over, I wanted to take control over. And like one of those things was I committed myself to my Zazen practice, my daily meditation practice. Let that, be something I come out of this strong.
Rebecca, I lost your audio. Has everybody else got her?
Probably wasn't important to say. Mm-hmm. Am I back?
Volume dropped a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It's just your volume, but yeah, if you can turn it up.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. The idea of, let this pandemic change me. What is it that I can do to make the most of this? So Charlie, when you talked about how people can choose to use trauma as growth, the very first thing you said is be with other people. And you said, I heard this, but I'm not sure that you meant it, but like this virtual thing ain't the same thing, right? So many of us are discouraged from being with other people, if we're high risk, all those things. So what does being with other people look like in a COVID world?
Right, it's a great question, because I went on lockdown on March the 5th, which was my birthday, so I'll never forget it. And I, like you stop traveling, you stop meeting with the neighbors and, going to church or whatever you do. And I, put on my analytic hat and said, how can I substitute for that? I know it can't be total, but what is it that I can do that can maybe combat some of it? And what I did in my mind is I built a bus. And on this bus, I've invited a lot of people to be on my bus. And I quite consciously reach out and talk to and interact with these folks using Zoom, regular old telephone calls, emails, what have you. But I make it a habit that I get in touch with everybody on my bus at least once a week. And the conversations always begin with, how are you doing? No, I mean, how are you really doing? So we don't go off into the weeds or something else. And it's been tremendously helpful. It doesn't substitute 100%, but it's something you can do. So you can make those phone calls, you can send those emails, and that begins to get rid of the helplessness that you're doing it. And, you know, then our neighbors, we sneak around and go stand in the middle of the street exactly 6 feet apart from each other. And, you know, but it's something you can do, that you've got some control. And when people start to really get that return sense of control, that's what's working. So I would encourage people, I mean, technically we call this re-engineering your social network, but okay, because the average person in the United States today only has 3 people in their close social network. Mm-hmm. That by itself is not good for your mental health. And then you bring in all of this other trauma that we got, and that was my first red flag that went off. So you start to do that, you start to build that, and I call it my bus. And the reason I do that, I heard some coach say once, he said, I'm a coach, my job is the team bus. I got to make sure I got the right people on the team bus in the right seats. Then I also need to make sure that I get the wrong people off of the bus. And you go, what are you talking about now? That comes down to something that really pops up in the social media. There's something we call the toxic person. Sometimes you have a toxic person in your network. This is the kind of person that when you interact with them, you feel emotionally drained. And I can send you a whole bunch of definitions, but those people tend to be the ones that's like, well, Fred, yeah, you can't see any hope. You think that's bad. Listen to the story I have. It's even worse than that.
Yeah.
And that reinforces it. So one of the things to do here is to, sometimes can be hard, is to identify the folks in your network who may be toxic and get them out, because it's just going to.
Yeah. And another thing I've noticed, Charlie, when I think about the bus, is I think about, who are the people I want on my bus?
Yeah, exactly.
To think about the future. And it's not necessarily to eliminate the negative Nellies, but in going through a few traumatic experiences of my own, different people show up in your life at different times with different levels of usefulness, right? So doing this Futures Friday is an excellent example of how I said, we're going to take a bus somewhere.
Right.
Who wants to be on the damn bus? And it was like kind of a free call. And it's been astonishing, the goodwill that people have generated with each other and the great ideas. I mean, Futures Friday has been a huge blessing to me as well. But, this notion of who should be on your bus, I also think about the breakdown in social fabric over the last 2 generations. So we have far fewer people identifying as non-denominational or not going to church, not believing in God, than going to church. And church, at least in my experience, was a major community building activity. You see people every single week. You've got the list of people that you're praying for, so who's in particular, dire straits. You've got the ladies guild, right? I mean, I know this is like a throwback, but who is doing the cooking and who is, doing the things, the potlucks, the things that bring people together. So we have a breakdown in that kind of religious community that would normally be filling a lot of the holes that we're starting to see. The second thing is the nuclear family, right? This notion, David Brooks wrote a great piece for the Atlantic about how the nuclear family was great for some people, but it was not great for a lot of other people for whom multi-generational relationships mean a lot. Because the nuclear family was about mobility, pick up and move to wherever that next job would be. And along with that, and this is a fascinating thing, like I can look at one thing on a house and I can tell which era it was built in. Is the porch on the front of the house or is it on the back of the house? Because when porches were built on the front of the house, we had a bias towards our neighbors. Think about that. We had a bias towards facing our neighbors. When we put the porches on the back of our house, it was like, screw my neighbors. I want to be by myself. And there's another thing that, you know, this kind of neighborhood breakdown. When you mentioned only, you know, we only have 3 close friends, how many of them are your next door neighbors?
Right.
Right? Do you feel that you have a network where you could ask? I don't. I've lived here for 4 years. I don't know the names of my across the street neighbors. I don't, yeah, I do know the name of the people on the left, but I wouldn't ask him for a thing. And I don't know the name of the people who live to the right of me. So, you know, we have over time, these structures have decomposed, have worn away. And so how do we use this moment as a way to rebuild some of that sense of community? And I would love to know from folks who are on the chat today, if there are things that you have done that have been really, you know, that you feel have been creative or nourishing, that have helped you sort of build your bus, you know, build this community. Let's talk a little bit more, Charlie, about this learned optimism, because I do feel like many of us go into the depths of despair, and we've got to be able to identify it and then make a choice. What are some ways that people can learn optimism?
Well, I think it's to me the best way, and I'm sort of an academic, so you know I'm going to say this: it's consciously spending time learning new things, not sitting still. Okay, so in today's world with YouTubes and everything else, it doesn't take much to reach out to get a positive message, to investigate something that you hadn't thought about. One of the things I do is I set up Google searches and listservs. And so every day I get messages, like I get inspirational quotes of the day. I get news feeds on social networks, for example. And I can kind of set that whatever way I want. So I'm getting positive information coming into me now. And I'm not getting the negative information. And that's why I've got this thing about social media, because it tends to close down your circle, and you end up only liking and interacting with people that are reinforcing what you already think. And that's exactly the opposite. You want to reach out to as many people with as many different viewpoints and consider them. So again, it's all about you taking control. And that really is the watershed moment. You ask, you know, what's that kind of switch that takes you from despair to growth? And it's when people say, wait a second, I'm in control, I am driving this bus, and here's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Charlie, along those lines of like learned optimism and how you've chosen to get these inspirational messages every day, you know, I think about, you know, the choices that I've made, the choices that I know other people have made during this pandemic, of things that we're just not doing anymore, that maybe we used to do because it was a past the time thing, but it's like now it's like, I don't have time for that. You know, like I've got more important, more relevant things to do. But it reminds me of Gretchen Rubin, who wrote The Happiness Project.
Right.
It's over 10 years old now. I did a happiness project myself in 2019. And the thing that has always stuck with me is that one of the keys to happiness is living in an atmosphere of growth. Living in an atmosphere of growth. And I know for myself now at 48 years old, it gets easier and easier to think like, I've got some answers now. I don't have to work as hard. And one of the things that this pandemic has done, of course, is thrown me back against the wall and say, all right, how do you do a keynote speaking business when there's no meetings in this room? You know, how do you reinvent your business? And it's been fantastic to have to think through this and to be able to come at this like an entrepreneur again. Like I remember that old hunger from when I first started the business. I'm like, how is this going to look? Joan G wrote the book on how to do your business plan, right? And all the things you have to think through as you're starting a business from scratch. But that atmosphere of growth. I wondered if it wouldn't be too personal, like what's one thing that you're working on right now? What's in your atmosphere of growth?
Oh my goodness, you got me with that one. I usually plan by the quarter. So every quarter I try to do something that develops a new skill. And right now that's about learning how to do 3D printing and leveraging with a computer. And on the other side of it is a goal this quarter is to do something and give it to people to help them. So what I've had to do, and yeah, I'm going to close with this, what I've had to do is sit back and say, what is it that I've got that could be a gift that I can give to other people to help them in these times of trauma and stress? So I've got the physical activity, skill-based thing going on, and then I've got that other thing going on. Now, as the weather cools, I'm in Arizona, I will be able to get back out in my shop and turn the creative switch back on and start to make things, little, whatever, you've seen some of them. But it's a balance between the kind of the physical and the social emotional thing that you keep in balance. And you shared with us, and thanks to you, that great little book on deep work.
Yeah.
Is that the correct title? That's tremendously helpful in situations like this, because you can start to structure your time. And I'm just going to tune out all of this stuff, and I'm going to focus on this, or maybe it's just a 90-minute block. So for me, it may be, okay, I'm going to take the next 90 minutes and I'm going to reach out to 10 people on my bus, as an example. Yeah. And you jarred a couple other things I want to mention. A great first step towards growth is the use of humor in your life. I want to give you a personal example. I've got a very, very close friend who's recovering from pancreatic cancer. And you want to talk about some trauma, okay? And we've set up a communication protocol that we will send each other jokes every day. So Gil sends me something that's going to make me laugh, and you can imagine where this goes. It gets
God. Don't repeat any of the jokes here, please.
No, I won't. It's certainly not safe for work, as they say. But the idea is that helps both of us tremendously not to get into the depths of despair, but it's like, oh, today's best joke. And then that invariably leads to something else. So just an idea.
I love it.
Go watch all of the old Laurel and Hardy movies, or what pick your poison, whatever. Three Stooges is my favorite.
Right, exactly. And to me, that's like, be careful what you put in your brain during this time, right? I mean, your brain is an organ. And treat it that way. So I wonder in the chat if anybody would be willing to share if they've taken up a new hobby or a new learning. Charlie's learning 3D printing, so that in part because when he goes back into his shop, he's going to probably be 3D printing some stuff, which is super cool. One of the things I've done is that we bought an old ski boat, and I'm back on my water skis since the first time since, I don't know, I was 22 years old. I've decided to do the deep dive back into foresight. There are some big sort of chapters of foresight that I didn't really know much about. So I've really taken that FuturePod podcast very seriously. And when one of these OG futurists mentions something, I'm like, huh. And then I do the really big deep dive. And then the other nerd circus that I've pursued, and some of what I did for myself, going back to think about what I thought about myself as a kid, as a youngster. Like, what were the things that I loved to do? And I remember when I was in college studying economics, and I loved the National Bureau of Economic Research. There were these cutting edge papers on stuff that deserved to be thought about. And now there's a ton being published on pandemics and the economy. So it's great to sort of lace up my old nerd sneakers and like go wading back into that marsh, even though in some cases I'm having to remember, like, who was this theoretician? Like, I remember it's back in the day. Charlie, the final thing before we turn it over to some audience conversation is, another way to turn our trauma into growth, or I shouldn't say turn our trauma into anything, but to use our trauma as a stepping stone to growth, is to use stories. And certainly this audience knows well that futurists use scenarios. And we've talked about how to look at a challenging future scenario, an expectable future scenario, and visionary scenarios. But when you're talking about stories, I'm not sure you're talking about scenarios. So when you say that using stories is a way to transform trauma into growth, what do you mean?
You're right. They're not quite scenarios. We don't have to bore these people with the technical difference. But for me, stories are really, it's the emotional tale of your life. And part of what I learned in coming out of this is simply being able to tell other people my story from a personal perspective, and they listen to it, and then they come back to me with their story, and then we can find common ground. It's like, oh wow, you felt the same way, you know? Okay, I'm not helpless anymore. It's that kind of thing. Use of stories in a therapeutic setting is a very, very powerful thing to do. And if you combine that with people in your social network and say, oh, well, Bob, why don't you tell me what's it like for you? You know, what happened to you the last time you went to the grocery store? Or, you know, one of your elderly parents, you can't go see them and physically visit them. I mean, how's that working for you? To share the stories, and it's stories from the heart, not stories from the head. Okay, that would be the key phrase. And being able to share that experience and have somebody else appreciate it grounds you. Like, okay, I'm not here all by myself.
Yeah.
Oh my God, and that opens up the conversation.
One of the things, Charlie, that you're so good at is, like, I shared my reckless story of acquiring a rib injury last week. And, you know, even though the story is hilarious, I fell in the lake while trying to pee. I'm just telling you guys the truth. I was trying to pee off the end of a pier and I fell in the lake, and then I ended up cracking a rib trying to get myself out. Long story. Anyway, Charlie did exactly what he's doing right now. But then at the end of our time together, he said, you take care of yourself. You get healed up real soon. And that's the other piece of this, Charlie, I think, is feeling heard and feeling seen. Because it is one thing to say, you know, what have you been up to? Or what's new with you? Or how are you really doing? It's next level to repeat back, heart to heart, that I heard you and I saw you. And that's such a beautiful gift that you give to all of us when you are with us.
There's one thing there, this idea of the bus in your network. The more you exercise that, the quicker you can get to that level of conversation with people. Then it almost becomes expected. And that's, again, it's got a multiplier effect. I mean, and I can tell, and you talk to somebody and all of a sudden they go quiet on the phone. So wait a second, you know, what's going on? And part of what's motivated me, and this is my growth coming out of this trauma, is I realized the number of people I was interacting with were really in the depths of despair. You know, they were experiencing what we call the dark night of the soul. And how do you go through that? And you know me, I try to always put some humor around it to kind of lighten things up a bit. But that whole thing, I'm conscious of time here, the depths of despair, about transformation. And real growth coming out of this is about transformation of yourself. And the storyline that I like to refer people to is Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. And then I lay that out for folks and say, okay, where are you in the hero's journey? Are you at, you know, this early step that you don't know what's going on? Or are you right down here in the helplessness depths of despair? Well, okay, fine. But here's the storyline. You know, you're just in act 2 of a 5-act play or something. So there's some hopefulness to it. And if you want it really cute with that, you say, well, why don't you go watch Brother, Wherefore Art Thou, one of the Coen brothers movies, because that whole movie is based on that storyline. And then people will see that movie and they go, oh my God, yeah, we're all chained together running through the field. That's what's going on right now. But, you know, we're going to end up at the radio station. We're going to get the record contract. So if those of you who haven't seen the movie, you really are. But that's the storyline that can help people understand what's going on. This is just the next chapter in there. Okay, I'll be quiet.
No, it's wonderful. But let's hear from our folks. So I think there are probably two branches of things that might be germane to people right now. One might be to share. If there is something that you have started to do since the before times, since the pandemic started, that you feel has helped you turn this into growth and you feel comfortable sharing, we'd love to know. You can raise your hand. We're a small enough group. You can raise your hand. You can drop an asterisk into your chat and Yaz will take you off mute and you can share that. We'd love to hear your voice. The other thing, so that's one thing. What have you done to grow if you'd like to share? But the other thing might be a question that you have for Charlie or a question that you have for the group about something that maybe you're wrestling with as you try to turn these stones into some sort of stone soup. Who'd like to start? Yaz, I'll leave it to you to moderate this. Thank you. Charlie, I don't know if you've seen the
yeah, I'm watching the chat team.
Yeah, so Steve Craig he's really been taking the deep dive into foresight work. Anne Marie being more hello-y than ever before, acknowledging people. I've noticed that out on walks as well. Even when you're masked, you know, you can I say a million things and really acknowledging people. Yeah, coming to Future Fridays, listening to podcasts. Biking, exploring trails. Oh, one of the things I wanted to mention when you were talking about learned optimism and we talked about this atmosphere of growth is one of the things I've noticed and I wonder if other people have had similar experiences is I am in a knowledge work job and then of course you look at the news feeds on top of that and one of the things I have found really helpful is doing hard physical work. So my level of gardening, my level of personal strength, my level of run, I have never been in better shape in the last 20 years, in part because I recognized that living up in my head was like, it reaches a point where there's just no margin of return. And my body was like, put me to work. And that has been something, I haven't been intentional, like I'm going to be able to bench press 50 pounds by the end of it. That's not where, it didn't start as a goal. It just started as like, I need to get out of this thing and I need to get in this thing and I need to make this do difficult things.
That's great. And then somebody mentioned biking and I'll tie these pieces together. It's all about balancing the energy centers in your body because all of this really drives you right up into your head. And you lose your grounding and it hits you physically right in the gut. And so you get those two centers out of balance. One thing I found is reconnecting with nature as part of it. So I've combined reconnecting with nature to get out of my head with the physical exercises, gets the body going. I get on my bike and I go out and I ride around all the trails in my neighborhood. You know, I watch the little bunnies run across the trails, you know, and that it grounds you and it gets you out of what you're saying in your head, not to mention the physical aspect that, you know, you start to build muscle mass and, you know, around here you start to sweat. But it's that get outside, get back in touch with nature. I knew a guy in Hawaii who made sandals that were made out of natural leather. He had a theory about electromagnetically connecting yourself with the earth. Don't wear rubber shoes, for example, that get yourself back into that force field. And you ought to try it. Run around in leather sandals or barefoot. Remember when you were a kid, you used to run around in the grass in your bare feet?
Yaz
Nothing?
is trying to jump in and interrupt you, Charlie, and she's
Okay.
being way too polite, so I'm just going to do it for her. Come on, Yaz.
I'd like to give Joan or Joanne an opportunity to unmute herself and share her example or her question with us.
Okay, I'm up.
Yes, go.
So I'm doing great in the summer. I've got friends that get together. We go for walks. I'm gardening at my daughter's house. The vegetable garden is great. I'm doing all kinds of stuff. I am petrified of winter. Where ice, I had a bad fall, so I can't deal with ice or walking. We're not going to be able to sit outside and have a cocktail, in the neighborhood, or eat on somebody's porch 8 feet apart. How do I deal with winter? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joan G. Charlie, I'm going to jump in first, and that is, Joan, if you haven't already, are you still at the same place where I've had brunch at your house? You can get 4 people in there comfortably, and if you have the right 4. But anyway, but the other thing I want to mention is I have a February birthday, and so I don't know why, maybe it's unrelated, but I have an unusual love affair with winter. And then I found out about that Scandinavian idea of hygge, that coziness. So what I now do is I stock up on candles. I stock up, I have my special wintertime only throws and sweaters and comforters. And I have mastered a couple of soup recipes. And I've got this, I have it planned out because our house is also big enough. We can have 6. We can have 6 socially distanced in our big living room, right? And everyone has to bring their own ladle. I will provide the bowls. They come in, they hand sanitize. They serve themselves with their own ladle, put their ladle in the sink, we'll wash that down later, and we can have hygge with a big bunch of soup, right? And then the other thing we can do is we have enough of these handheld device games now that we can play Pinochle or we can play a card game using these, but we're all together, but we're playing the card game. And then we put a time limit on it. Like this is a 90-minute in and out. So I've been pre-thinking my plan for the winter as well. And I'm not going to be able to get together as often or with as many, but I'm going to ask people to come to me because A, I have the space, and B, I got some bitchin' soup recipes. Over. Charlie, what do you think?
Well, one thing, Joan, do you live near an indoor mall, a covered mall? Getting out and walking in bad weather, when I lived up in the mountains in the snow, that's what we do in the winter. Is you can't be out on slippery sidewalks and everything. And small groups of us would go to the mall inside and we'd walk around for a while and get our exercise, and we'd sit down in benches and you could socially distance. Coffee shop, I mean, it was like, I need to get up and move to in a physical environment that's somewhat safe. In indoor malls, and I don't know the neighborhood you live in, but they're like all over the place. And there's not a lot of activity in them right now. So that may be something you can do. Rebecca's thing about cooking, I'm somewhat of a cook, so I'm looking forward to the fall and winter. That's when I start cooking and I go around and I give it away to all my neighbors.
That's very kind. I want to come in with 2 more. Paul Roebuck, he's sharing with us that he's been using this time to slow down and to explore his neighborhoods and explore takeout foods and things like that, getting projects done. And then we have Mike Baker, who would like to be unmuted and share his example. Would you please go ahead?
All right, sure. Just a couple of observations, and I guess I'll try to answer the question as well. First of all, Rebecca, if you don't have a lentil soup recipe in your, let me know.
I can always use another one. Please send.
We make weekly, and we haven't gotten sick of it, and it's been probably a good 9 months. We love it. So first of all, great conversation. Just gives me a lot to think about. I think a couple things that I would add that maybe that I've approached a little differently in the last several months. That's allowed me to reflect and experience, I suppose, more traumatic period in a positive way, and that's music, and appreciating music in different ways. The music of John Prine stands out as an example, just a phenomenal songwriter, passed away a few months ago due to COVID, but his music obviously lives on and is incredibly powerful. Exercise, I'll say that really is a way to try and motivate myself to do a little more. And Rebecca, hearing some of your thoughts. I actually did take a positive step by buying some like gymnastics rings, and they're hanging up right outside my house. And I do a couple pull-ups every day, but not much more than that. But now I think I'm gonna this is a way of committing myself to doing more. And then finally, I'll say I'm glad, Charlie, you mentioned the stuff around Joseph Campbell, because the understanding stories and the question about where are you in the hero's journey, I think is a great one and a great way to make those concepts very accessible. The guy who created the TV show Community, name is Dan Harmon, has something similar. I think has sort of an adaptation of the Joseph Campbell stuff, and he tries to incorporate those elements into that show, which are always kind of entertaining to try and pick out. Anyway, those are my comments. So thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Mike. We're glad you were here with us. We need to put a lid on this sucker. So Charlie, I would like to welcome you into the plug zone. What is it that you would like to plug? Thank you for spending your time with us. How can we support you?
Well, actually, it's how can I support you? I've been working on, as part of what we talked about, something I'm calling the self-care first aid kit. And it's a document. It's going to run about 15 pages long. And it's a pocket guide for people who are feeling distressed. And it not only will allow you to do self-assessment, self-scoring, what degree of stress and trauma are you currently experiencing? Where does that fit with national norms? And then there's some exercises about specific things you can do about the social network as a support mechanism, and also about sort of balancing out your energy centers. And then lastly, there's a whole bunch of checklists of things you can do physically, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually to take care of yourself when this is going on. It'll be ready for distribution sometime next week. I am giving it away. And if you would like to get a free copy of the self-care first aid kit, just figure out a way to give me your email address. And
we've got it.
When you
we've
get
got
it,
their addresses.
You can give it to anybody else that you know that you think could use just a little bit of help. Again, it's first aid. This is not a substitute for, some sort of clinical intervention, but it'll get people going. It will start to give them some hope and get rid of some of that helplessness. So that's my plug.
Thank you, Charlie. We have everybody's email who's registered for today. In addition to Charlie's first aid kit, which we'll be sending you after it becomes available, we're going to be sending you a few articles, PDFs, including A Cure for Burnout and the Neurology of Relationships, written by one of Charlie's colleagues. Charlie passed along another article from Contentment magazine about dealing with trauma. We'll be sending those out in a Google folder. We'll send the link to the folder, and then both of the PDFs will be nested in there. So thanks in advance to Yasmin for helping us assemble that. We want to wish you a peaceful weekend. There's a lot going on right now, Please take care of yourselves and take care of maybe just one other person, right?
Yep.
Listen and reflect. Charlie, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Must.
All right. See you guys.
Take care.
Take care.
Stay safe out there.